Greetings and welcome. In this video, we raise a very basic question. A question, even though so fundamental, that is never raised, especially in church circles. And what is surprising is that it is not raised even in the midst of free thinking Christians. What is that question? The question is, can the teachings of Jesus Christ that apply to individual life also apply to the life of churches? I repeat the question. We need to fix that question clearly in our mind to be able to think in a sustained, logical, factual fashion and arrive at some kind of understanding. Can the teachings of Jesus Christ that clearly apply to the spiritual life of individuals also apply to the life of churches? After all, churches are compounded of individuals. The strangest thing from my perspective is that even though churches are made up of individual Christian believers, there is a clear division between what applies to individual believers and what applies to church life. We've got used to the idea, we are inured to the idea, or we are habituated to the idea that what applies to individual Christian believers need not apply and indeed cannot apply to the life of churches. To illustrate this very interesting issue, this glaring contradiction, let me give you an instance. Think of the 19th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. There you find from verse 16 onwards an encounter, a very significant, eye-opening encounter between Jesus and a rich young man. I will not bother you with a full description of the details of that encounter. I invite your attention particularly to verse 21, where we find Jesus saying to the young man, "If you would be perfect, go, sell all you have, give to the poor, come and follow me, then you will have life." Now, in order to make sure that I am quoting correctly, let me read that verse. Jesus said to the rich young man, "If you would be perfect, go sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." So that is the advice. So Jesus here indicates that it is a spiritual hindrance to be attached to any earthly possessions or to have an idea of life and therefore a way of life that depends largely for its security, material possessions, rather than trusting the faithfulness of God. This idea again can be found as stated elaborately by Jesus in the 6th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus says that we should not put our trust in the riches of the world, because after all, the riches of the world are unstable, they are perishable, and they therefore do not offer any stable point of security and sustenance. Now the question is, no one will dispute that this teaching of Jesus, namely that accumulating material wealth and being attached to wealth is a serious hindrance to one's spiritual development. After all, Jesus said very emphatically that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Or think of the 16th chapter of Luke's Gospel, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Because the rich man was more attached to his wealth than to the needy man at his gate, in that story, Jesus portrays the rich man as being eligible only for the warmer hospitality of hell. So look at it in any which way you want. The conclusion is inevitable that as far as individual Christians are concerned, individual believers are concerned, they are required to regard worldly possessions, worldly wealth, any attachment thereto as a serious spiritual hindrance. Now that is clearly established. I don't think there is a single individual in Christendom, either now or any time in the past 20 centuries, who would doubt or debate this basic principle. It is so fundamental to the teaching of Jesus Christ. After all, he himself is the role model for it, because he said, the foxes have their holes, birds in the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Gospel of Luke chapter 9, verse 58. So this principle is absolutely clear. There is no margin of uncertainty left in this regard. If you are an individual believer, accumulation of worldly possessions and any trace of attachment to them is a serious hindrance to your spiritual health and your spiritual progress, and it serves as a hindrance to your relationship with God. As Jesus said emphatically in the 24th verse of the 6th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, no one can serve two masters, God and mammon. Either you love the one or you hate the other. So there is absolutely no doubt on this matter. But have you ever heard either a bishop or a priest or a lay believer at any point in your life, anywhere, in any context, wondering whether the same principle should apply to the life of churches? Absolutely not. I can guarantee you that it has never occurred to you. It has never occurred to anyone among Christians. Rather, the assumption is exactly to the contrary. The reigning assumption in our midst is that while it is bad, indeed very bad, tragically bad, outrageously bad, for individual believers to be rich and to be attached to their wealth, it is not only good, but it is necessary, inevitably necessary, irreducibly necessary for churches to acquire more and more wealth, for churches to become richer and richer and richer. And it's also the most sacred and irreducible duty of individual believers as members of churches to donate, to contribute more and more generously to their churches, so that their churches can become richer and richer and richer, more and more affluent, more and more respected in worldly terms. But this contradiction is completely overlooked. Nobody is bothered about it. Rather, if anyone points out this contradiction, he will be singled out as a heretic or as an enemy of Christianity, and at least an enemy of the church. So this is something that we need to become conscious of. Simple logic will tell you that what applies to individuals must also apply to the collectivities of which the same individuals are members. For example, if I am a member of an academic society, what applies to me must apply to the society to which I belong. Or between what applies to the society and what applies to me, there cannot be a contradiction. Suppose I belong to a philosophical society, a society that is devoted to serious reflection, thinking, contemplation, analysis, in order to understand the realities of the world better and more clearly. Suppose I belong to such a society. I have to maintain a certain discipline in my life to be able to be of the philosophical kind. Now, but suppose the society to which I belong is anything but philosophical. It is not interested in anything intellectual. It is not interested in thinking. It's only interested in eating, drinking, and merrymaking. It is only interested in collecting more and more money, making more bigger and bigger buildings, and throwing parties left, right, and center to influence politicians and to cultivate social networks. Now, I will not belong to that society. I cannot belong to that society unless I also abandon my philosophical interest. Either the society to which I belong has philosophical interest, or I abandon my philosophical interest to belong harmoniously to the society which once upon a time had philosophical interest but now only has worldly interests, drinking, merrymaking, seeking worldly pleasures. It cannot be that the society deems itself exempted from the discipline that I, as a member of the society, am required to maintain, and it goes its own way, but I am still under the requirement to strictly maintain the discipline of being a philosopher. By the way, being a philosopher is not a small thing. If you look at the Athenian context, the Greek context, it was axiomatically believed that to be a proper philosopher, one had to renounce attachment to worldly possessions. So poverty was considered a basic discipline for being a philosopher. And also, a philosopher was required to maintain simplicity of life. In fact, for many philosophers, particularly in the cynical school, the school of cynics, C-Y-N-I-C, cynic, the cynics, of which the foremost example is Diogenes. Diogenes, who had that memorable encounter with Alexander the Great. Diogenes, not Demosthenes, but Diogenes, who was visited by Alexander in the city of Corinth. So according to the philosophical school of cynics, a philosopher was entitled only to have one blanket. He would cover himself in a coarse, rough blanket, and he was required to grow his hair. So the two distinguishing features of a philosopher in the school was he was allowed to have a blanket to cover himself, no other dress. Life was reduced to such simplicity, and he was not allowed to be fashionable in his hairstyle. His hair had to grow and grow wild. So that was the life of a philosopher. And then of course, as we know, many of the philosophers refrained from marriage because they believed that matrimony distracted because of the sensual pressures attached to married life. They distracted the pure pursuit of knowledge. So poverty, simplicity of life, celibacy, all these were the essential ingredients of the philosophical discipline. It was from this that the Catholic Church borrowed via the 3rd, 4th century after the death of the Lord Jesus Christ, the great admixture that took place between Christianity and the Greek context. After all, even today, one of the two standard versions of the Bible is the Greek Bible. Okay, so the interface between Christianity and Hellenism is a very, very important phenomenon to understand if we have to know Christianity as it has evolved to our times. And if you really look into the historical details of this, you'll be astonished to see the extent to which the Greek context influenced and reshaped Christianity, but let that be subject for another occasion. So there is the philosophical discipline. So the Greek philosophical schools, there were four of them: the academics, the peripatetics, the Stoics, the Epicureans, right? So all of them maintained a certain homogeneity, a certain harmony, a certain consistency between the individual member and the group. There was no contradiction between the two. But when it comes to the church, the individuals are required to believe in and, if possible, practice the teachings of Jesus Christ, but the church will have none of it. For example, Jesus said, and this is one of the most significant teachings of Jesus Christ, you find this as part of the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Do you think this will be acceptable to churches? Churches will actually expect you, compel you to hate its enemies. And you will be considered disloyal to church if you say, no, I will rather stay loyal to the teachings of Jesus Christ who has taught us that we should love our enemies. Suppose you are a member of the Orthodox Church in Kerala, and that church is in unending enmity with the Jacobite Church. And as a Bible-believing, Jesus-heeding Orthodox, you say, no, you, the Bhava Tirumeni, out of your extreme spiritual enlightenment and zeal for the church, you expect all of us to hate Jacobites. And the supreme head of the Jacobite church does the same thing. He expects his followers to hate the members of the Orthodox Church. Suppose two members, one member each from both sides says, look, we would rather follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, who insists that we love our enemies. What do you think will happen to them? How will the churches to which they belong, deal with them? They'll be ostracized. They'll be cast out. At least they'll be stigmatized as an enemy of the church concerned. So that's why I'm saying it's high time for us to realize that the teachings of Jesus Christ are deemed as applicable, relevant only to individual Christian believers. None of these teachings is deemed applicable or relevant to church life. And if you suggest to any church leader of some distinction, that churches must conform to the teachings of Jesus Christ, he will rise manfully and damn you to the outermost circle of hell. This explains why in the book of Revelation, by the way, it is book of Revelation and not Revelations because of the Indian context. I've heard many people refer to the last book in the Bible as the book of Revelations. It is not the book of Revelations, it's the book of Revelation. So in the third chapter of the book of Revelation, verse 15 onwards, 15 to 20, where the message to the church at Laodicea is recorded. Jesus is presented as being kept outside, excluded from the life of the church. In the light of what we have encountered or explored so far, the logic for this exclusion, this inevitable and complete exclusion, can be understood. And it will be very interesting to follow up on this simple lead that I have provided. Examine the life of the church in all its details. You will find that this principle applies brutally, mercilessly, that the teachings of Jesus Christ are deemed completely inapplicable, inadmissible, in fact harmful to the life of the church, to the interest of the church. But what is propounded from the pulpit, the liturgy that is followed, everything is presumably based on the teachings of Jesus Christ, the public ministry of Jesus Christ as the author and the perfect of our faith, so on and so forth. But None of the teachings of Jesus Christ in actual practice will be admitted as relevant or even tolerable to the life of the church. Jesus and his vision of life, his spiritual discipline, is deemed in a tacit manner, without proclaiming it, deemed in a tacit manner to be an insufferable inconvenience to the interest of every church in the world. And this is a contradiction that we as individual believers need to have the courage to recognize. And what that recognition may lead to is up to each one of you. I'm not sitting here to prescribe, to pontificate, saying these are the consequences. Let the consequences be experienced by individuals themselves, but my duty is to point out the truth that prevails in our midst. And certainly it's an important truth for us to recognize that there is a blatant contradiction between two sets of assumptions. One set of assumptions is applicable to individual believers. The other set of assumptions is applicable to the life of the church. When it comes to the life of the church, it is only the principle of mammon that is welcome. And there's no church that believes that without mammon a church can survive. Without God, church can do eminently well. But without mammon, no church can survive. And every individual Christian has internalized it. Whenever in the past I have said that churches must re-examine their covetousness, and churches at least must not practice corruption in order to galvanize or gather money for churches, because what is godly cannot be erected on foundations of corruption. Christians have sounded very indignant, and they have asked me the counter question: how can a church survive without money? The church needs money. Well, my argument is not that church does not need money. My argument is that church also needs God, and therefore the church's dependence on money cannot be absolute. And the manner in which the church goes after generating or gathering the resources for its worldly sustenance cannot be in flagrant violation of the discipline that is embedded in its relationship with God. Churches must not abandon God in order to seek the benefits of mammon for its own survival. That's the only point I'm making. Let there be a harmony between church, its interests, its actions, agenda, priorities, and its professed commitment to God through Jesus Christ, the will of God as revealed by Jesus, and the moral imperatives that issue from the revelation of that will. And anything that harmonizes with it is fine. But what is not acceptable and what should never be acceptable to an individual Christian believer is the complete violation of every particle of the discipline pertaining to our relationship with God in the interest of protecting and promoting the material and worldly interests of the church. That's precisely the point. So anyway, let me once again highlight this issue. The principles taught by Jesus Christ are assumed to be necessary and relevant to the life of individual believer, whereas they are considered to be harmful and unacceptable to the life of churches. And yet, churches are nothing but the aggregations of individual believers who are required to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, whereas the church will have none of it. So what do you think about this contradiction? I am very eagerly awaiting to hear your responses, and I wish all of you a great time ahead. Thank you.